Senate session is resumed.
Acting Madam President, we revert to motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate and moved by Minister.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy President. Regrettably, we have one of our members who has been acting in a role as Deputy President for the day who has to exit the chamber for a moment, and so we are proposing to appoint another acting Deputy President who will serve as Chairman of Committees for the remainder of today's session, and the proposal is to nominate Senator the Honourable Lindell Nurse to serve as acting Deputy President for the remainder of today's sitting.
Madam Deputy President, I beg a second.
The question is that Senator Lindell Nurse do serve as the acting Deputy President for the remainder of today's sitting. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no.
Madam Deputy President, I wish, as Senator Andrew Malalou exits the chamber, I wish to express the appreciation of the Honourable the Senate for his service. He is arguably one of the new members of this chamber, and he served credibly as the Deputy President for even if it was a short stint, and I want to express our appreciation for that.
Thank you very much. Senator Cummings, you beat me to it. Welcome to the chair, Senator Nurse, acting Deputy President for the remainder of the session.
Public business resumed.
Public business is again the order of the day.
Order number 4, in the name of the Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Protection of Agricultural Products Bill 2022.
Senator Cummings, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy President. I didn't mean to beat you to it just now. I just know that in the early stages of today, it took not a small amount of convincing to welcome Senator Malalou to the role of Deputy President, and so I felt it was my responsibility as well to, having asked him, to thank him at the same time for agreeing to serve in a role that he was somewhat unfamiliar with. Now, Madam Deputy President, we are discussing this afternoon in the sitting of the Senate a matter that has received widespread discussion, largely in support of measures to support the farming community. Madam Deputy President, this is a substantive matter which is before the Honourable the Senate for the consideration of all members. It has already passed in the other place, and it simply seeks, Madam Deputy President, to repeal and replace the 2017 legislation which would have governed what we anecdotally call the predial larceny bill, and replace it now with a new piece of legislation in 2022. Now, why would we wish to do that, Madam Deputy President? Now, it is no secret, if I were to start from a macro point of view, the Honourable Senator Dr. Chelson Brathwaite, who has spoken in this chamber and who has spoken globally, regionally and locally over many years and has made his career and has become an exemplar in this field, the importance of the agricultural sector is not to be understated. The importance of the agricultural sector and the ability of a country to feed itself is also not to be understated. The importance of food security, Madam Deputy President, as has been the context of our discussion around the agricultural sector, especially in a country that has a net food importing bill and therefore uses foreign exchange in significant quantities to be able to feed itself and to feed its people. the notion of local production and the ability of a country to ensure that local production reaches the markets for which it is intended and the people for whom it is intended, and that farmers are not incurring significant losses after investing their resources in agricultural production, sowing and planting, and then harvesting and preparing for sale, Madam President, that these protections are afforded to farmers. If I go into a commercial establishment anywhere further down the road from this Parliament building, Madam Deputy President, there are stiff penalties in place if I walk into any of those commercial establishments and I take up that which is not mine and I walk out with it. If I, Madam Deputy President, walk into a bank and I attempt to take up things that are not mine, I will face the courts and there will be stiff penalties, Madam Deputy President. If I damage life or limb in the process of so doing, there are also stiff penalties, and this legislation, in its revised form, seeks to ensure that the same protections that are made available to all persons functioning in a commercial space, that they are also afforded to farmers who contribute to the things that I listed before, our ability to feed ourselves and therefore our food security, reducing the food import bill and therefore reducing the amount of foreign exchange outflows that go out in order to support ourselves. And then ultimately, Madam President, the critical thing that is also important is that these are people who have invested their lives, invested in their livelihoods, and have put their resources into building what effectively, while we may look at them as farms and they're producing food, these are businesses. They are earning a living from the creation of businesses in agriculture, and we are giving them the same protections that are afforded to every other businessman, whether he wears a suit, Wellington boots, and goes into the garden in the mud and among the worms and all of the insecticides that have to be used, or if he is in a high-rise office in a corner skylight office. These are the protections that have to be afforded to our people when they engage in meaningful endeavors to support themselves and their families, and in turn to grow a nation. Now, the 2017 bill had a number of elements, and I want to speak to what some of those elements are and what the differences are between the 2017 legislation and the 2022 legislation. Madam President, we had a number of vegetable seeds, bulbs, and so on listed in the 2017 legislation, plants or products thereof. The 2022 legislation significantly further expands on what was contained in the 2017 legislation. It includes, in addition to the items that were listed then, sugarcane, culinary herbs. It adds livestock, poultry, planting material, and also freshwater fish for human consumption. These items were not included, Madam Deputy President, in the 2017 bill, and they are now included in the 2022 bill. Equally so, Madam Deputy President, it also provides, importantly, a definition for what constitutes commercial quantities of agricultural products. This was not defined in the 2017 legislation. While it was covered in the 1994 regulations, it was not covered in the actual legislation. And so the 2022 Act seeks to simplify both the items and the quantities to ensure that the policing of what constitutes commercial quantities of agricultural products can take place with absolute clarity and transparency, and for the purpose of enforcement. Now, the 2022 Act also includes a couple of things which are going to be important because they're already listed, but it expands it a little bit further. The Act requests that there are transaction records which cover your receipts, your delivery notes, your bill of lading as evidence. What was required before was a certificate of purchase, certificate of conveyance of agricultural products, certificate of conveyance of livestock, and the same thing for the transfer of livestock ownership. That could only have been done previously by the ministry with responsibility for agriculture. That now is being addressed by ensuring that there are specific transaction records that will be available even if in the Ministry of Agriculture, there are some issues there in terms of sometimes, you go to the office and you can't get this and you can't get that. So these things are out there. But this is perhaps the most important thing that we want to make sure is there, Madam President. In the 2017 bill, the penalties for predial larceny, and I use the word because in its anecdotal form, that is what we call it, that's what Barbadians call it. If you were convicted of stealing or falsifying records or both, you were found guilty, you had a penalty of $10,000 or 5 years imprisonment. In the 2022 bill, as an indication of the seriousness with which the government of Barbados under this Barbados Labour Party administration treats to agriculture in the same way it treats to the man in the suit in the high-rise building in his corner office, if you are convicted of stealing, you are then liable to a fine of $100,000 or 5 years or both. Because if you cannot go into somebody's establishment and take up what is not yours, you should not be able to go into somebody's farm, which is their place of business, and take up that which is not yours. Now, I have heard some conversations in a public space that sometimes I think to myself, boy, Senator Boyce talked about culture and education. And we know that Barbados is sometimes a Kadair society. You could do the worst thing. But when punishment comes, we as a culture, as a people, still feel bad. We don't want to see people hurt, or we don't want to see people punished. That is the nature of Barbadian society a lot of times. So I have seen a conversation evolving in social media, which I find troubling, Madam Deputy President. So a farmer who's a small man like you, in some instances, I'm not talking always about big operators, but big operators are investing big money too. But he's a small farmer just like you. But you go on the man's lot and you take what is not yours, and somebody out there is saying, but how you expect the man to live? If you were to do that in Broad Street, would somebody say, but how you expect the man to live if you go on Broad Street and take up something that's not yours? We have to be able to recognize right for right and wrong for wrong. And when something is wrong, we call it wrong. If there is a societal issue and people are challenged and people are trying to make ends meet and to live, Barbados is still that place where you can go and ask somebody for a breadfruit. Barbados is still that place where you can go and say to the plantation owner, sir, I'm struggling this month, I need some extra help. I want to know if you would agree to give me a couple of sweet potatoes or a couple of yams to be able to feed my children. Barbados is still that place where you can get help when you ask for it. But it is not the place where you can go and take up that which does not belong to you, because that person that you are stealing from also has a responsibility to their own livelihood and to their families. And so it is important that we are our brother's keeper, that we as a government ensure that there are the opportunities that are made available for people to earn a living and to gain employment. But at the same time, when we do the wrong thing, we have to accept that it is the wrong thing. Now, I am sure that in the other place there has been, and in this place, in the last Parliament, there was a joint select committee which looked at vending. And we had an extensive discussion as a nation, and I say as a nation, not even just as a parliament, because there was a select committee established for the purpose of having discussions and bringing in all the stakeholders to share what their views are. And we came in and we talked about the conditions under which vending needed to be decriminalized, the conditions under which we needed to create safe spaces for vending to take place, the registration, the licensing processes. All of those things were articulated as part of a national conversation on what vending would look like. And in the same fashion, Madam Deputy President, we are now here saying that having decriminalized vending, that equally so, we want to ensure that there is an end-to-end process that captures from farmers all the way through to vendors a legitimate process that says these are legitimate people doing legitimate business and who do not deserve to be criminalized, neither do they deserve to have their produce and the fruits of their labor stolen and taken by persons who have not contributed, who want to reap, in the proverbial terms, Madam Deputy President, reap where they have not sown. So there are a number of mechanisms that are included now in this legislation that we anticipate could be taken or need to be taken to reduce the level of incidents of radial larceny. One, prevention, and this includes the mechanisms for the utilization of drone technology. Now, the Ministry of Agriculture has already shared what their challenges are, including with the limited capacity of the Barbados Police Service to be able to be everywhere at all times, but that is also the responsibility in the same way that you have the same commercial establishment down the road that is responsible for providing their own security, farmers to have a responsibility for providing security for their private lands, privately owned lands. But there's one element within there that I want to take just one moment to speak about, which is drones. When we as an administration brought under the ministry that I'm responsible for, unmanned aerial vehicles legislation, specifically for commercial use in the last parliament, one of the elements that was included in there was the possibility of utilization of drones for commercial agriculture and ensuring that drones can be used to survey lands used for agriculture to ensure that you were able to protect crops. Same thing applies for drones for detection of intrusions, and that also covers surveillance systems also using unmanned aerial vehicles. Tracking systems are also envisaged, Madam Deputy President, including things like I mentioned drones before, but it also includes tags and then some kind of physical tracking. And then finally, where the government comes in with this piece of legislation is the question of enforcement. Now, I want to call on the communities across Barbados to collaborate closely with the governments, with the farmers in your district where applicable, and with your relevant agencies. This only works, Madam Deputy President, if we work together. The notion of enforcement only works if when something is wrong, we say something is wrong. The notion of people not cooperating with the police or not cooperating with the authorities but expecting results is something that is counterintuitive almost, Madam Deputy President. So this is a piece of legislation that we expect will contribute positively to the development of the agricultural industry in the country. The Ministry of Agriculture has been speaking at great length regularly about the efforts that are underway with them. Presently, we are preparing as a government, certainly even under my ministry, to collaborate. We just launched last week Friday, the Barbados Food and Rum Festival. This year, in the Food and Rum Festival, we will be integrating farmers markets and integrating local produce, including fishermen and farmers. We have events which are going to take place in Oysters because the integration of our farming community is critical to the creation of linkages between all of our productive sectors. Come next month, Madam Deputy President, we will be hosting here in Barbados a group of our cruise line partners where we will be negotiating provisioning for cruise ships. We have already looked at, to go back to the import bill and what we're importing, we have already done an analysis of all of the items that are imported into the country for the purpose of provisioning cruise lines. And we have begun, therefore, to work with both our agricultural sector and our other productive sectors, including manufacturing, agro-processing, and so on, to identify what the products are that Barbados can meaningfully supply cruise ships with on an annual basis to feed a minimum of 700,000 people over the course of the winter cruise season from 2022 to 2023. So we are a government, and I'm only speaking about some of the things that are happening in my own space, in a ministry that I'm responsible for. But we as a government and led by the Minister of Agriculture, who is doing an exceptional job, moving from country to country, community to community, farmer to farmer, and legislative reform to legislative reform to ensure that Barbados is positioned to feed itself, to reach the objectives of food security, to minimize the food import bill, and to ensure that people are able to view agriculture as a meaningful source of earning a living and as a development path for Barbados as a country. And with these few words, Madam Deputy President, I commend this bill to this honourable chamber, and I beg to move that it be read a second time.
Senator Dr. Brathwaite.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. Good afternoon to all fellow senators. Madam Deputy President, I rise in support of the Protection of Agricultural Products Bill 2022, which has been brought to the attention of this honorable chamber. I support the bill because in our vision for the future of agriculture in Barbados, which was developed in 2012 and which is still relevant today, we have stated quite clearly that deficient legislation in areas such as food imports, pre-deal larceny, and land use policy are critically important to improving the agricultural sector. Madam President, I have stated in this chamber before, and I wish to state it again, that the efforts that are being made by the Miamotley administration are critical building blocks for a nation that has the potential to be food secure. And in fact, I have stated before that the efforts that are being made from a political point of view are some of the most significant that have been made in the last 80 years in this country, since the days when John Saint legislated in the House that 12% of all land should be assigned to food crops in 1945. And therefore, today, I rise to support this bill because it represents, in my view, one of the building blocks that is fundamental to the success which we are hoping to achieve. We're hoping to achieve, Madam President, a reduction in the food import bill. We're hoping to achieve the production of fresh, nutritious food for the population that can help to reduce the incidence of chronic non-communicable diseases. We're hoping to achieve the development of agribusiness enterprises that can, in fact, promote employment opportunities and help to diversify the Barbadian economy. We're hoping to produce foods based on agro-processing that can reduce the significant amount of processed foods that we import. We're hoping to generate the production of food in the local economy closer to the marketplace, rather than importing food from abroad for our people and for tourists. In fact, I just heard from Senator Lisa Cummins the efforts that are being made to link the agricultural sector and the tourism sector. And I would like to congratulate her and her ministry for these initiatives that are being taken, which are critical to our future. We cannot continue to import the food for the tourists, bring the tourists to our shores, and then import the food from the same place that the tourists came from to feed them in Barbados. That is not good economic strategy. I also think it's critically important that we see the agricultural sector as an important part of the preservation of our landscapes and our ecology. Critically important to reducing the amount of land that is idle and is covered by river tambourine and other undesirable crops, and seeking to maintain the beauty of this country. Reducing the incidence of the possibility of diseases from rats and vermin occupying unused lands, which should be in agricultural production and producing food for our country. And therefore, Madam President, I support the bill because I am fully aware of the risks that farmers face in their efforts not only to make a living, but to assist in feeding this nation. In our analysis of risks, and this morning we had a very interesting presentation on financial risks right here in the Senate when we spoke of the bonds that are being proposed by government. But this evening I wish to talk about some other risks the farmer faces. I wish to speak about environmental risks. The farmer faces the risks of climate change, the risks of extreme weather events, the risks of hurricanes, the risks of floods, the risks of drought, and the risks of global warming. In the area of biological risks, the farmer faces the risks of pests and diseases, the risks of monkeys and other organisms and animals that may destroy his crop. In the area of financial risks, the farmer faces the cost of production due to the price of inputs and the challenges he may face when he borrows money for his farm and then is unable to reap a product to pay those loans. Institutional risk, the risks associated with government policy, the risks associated with changing market forces and the cost of borrowing, inputs, the level of price support, and competition from imported products that may undermine his production. These are all risks that the farmer faces. Madam Deputy President, while all of these risks have the potential to limit national agricultural production and farmers' income, in my view, there are personal and human risks that can be devastating. Among these, the most severe is the problem of predial larceny, or better put, the theft of agricultural products of the farm by other human beings. Madam President, there can be no greater injustice, pain, and suffering than when a farmer faces all the risks that I have described above, produces a crop or a livestock, and on the eve of harvest is deprived of his just reward by thieves who harvest it before the farmer can. Madam President, there can be no greater injustice. And while the bill seeks to address these problems of predial larceny, I am of the view that even as we increase the fees and the fines for such offenses, this bill will not solve the problem. The bill must not only be passed in this chamber, but it must be implemented. And this bill should not suffer from implementation deficit. Madam President, the stealing of agricultural produce is not an agricultural problem. The stealing of agricultural produce is theft. It's a criminal offense that must be given high priority by the law enforcement institutions of this land, and thieves must be punished. Predial larceny is now being seen as organized crime, where criminals are armed with dangerous, sophisticated weapons and ammunition, and way above the reach of the average farmer. And so I hope that in the implementation of the provisions of this bill, that 4 things will happen. First of all, I hope that the security forces, the law courts, the Barbados Police Service, the Defense Force will give priority attention to the protection of farmers and farmers' produce by the enforcement of this legislation. I hope that the Barbados justice system will examine the possibility of a victim support mechanism and restitution where farmers are adequately compensated for their losses. I hope that this bill will be brought to the attention of the public to ensure that there is more public awareness of the problem and that we seek public support for the measures proposed. Public support not only for the measures proposed, but public support for public safety. Let me give you an example of what I mean when I speak of public safety. It is possible that thieves may steal a crop that has been sprayed with a toxic chemical before the expiration date of the chemical in the crop. When that crop gets to the marketplace to be purchased by consumers, and consumers are not aware that it's stolen produce, it may in fact be contaminated with high levels of pesticide, and this could be a threat to public health. And therefore, it is important that we see this not only as an agricultural problem, it's a societal problem. It's a health problem. There are health risks involved because chemicals which are sprayed on crops have a shelf life. And normally you spray and then there's a period of time that must expire before the crop is harvested. If the thieves harvest the crop before the expiry of the shelf life and the life of that chemical, it could be toxic to consumers. I also hope that the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Nutrition Security will investigate the possibility of providing a crop and livestock insurance program to protect farmers against predial larceny and other risks, especially the risks associated with climate change. We have a hurricane. A farmer's crops are destroyed by the hurricane. He has to start all over again, and he has no way of starting because there's no insurance and there's no facility to get him up and going. This is important in the context of countries that depend substantially on local farmers to feed the country. We've had an unfortunate situation where a significant amount of our food comes from abroad. And sometimes the consumer is not aware of the significance of the farmer in the context of food security, because our agriculture, unfortunately, was designed to produce crops for the metropole and for abroad, instead of feeding our population. It is fundamentally important, therefore, in the context of looking at the disastrous effects of climate change, hurricanes and floods, that we recognize the importance of local farmers to the sustainability of our food supplies and put in place insurance and other mitigating efforts to ensure the farmer can start again after devastating environmental occurrence. Madam Deputy President, I hope that in addition to the measures proposed, that we will take appropriate action to establish a technology-based predial larceny coordinating unit in the relevant ministry, either in the Ministry of Agriculture or in the appropriate human resource section of the police service, a unit that would be staffed by high-rank officers of the police service or seconded from the police service to the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security, that see the stealing of agricultural produce as a problem of theft and crime, and not an agricultural problem, but a problem of theft, and that can give appropriate priority to the establishment of a database of farmers, maintain a database of incidents, liaise with farmers to secure their premises, police the markets to ensure that stolen produce are identified by traceability systems, attend and document case hearings in the courts, and respond to farmers' suggestions and questions. That we can establish traceability system. There's no technology available for establishing traceability systems that can track the movement of domestic produce, especially animals, where we can use tamper-proof systems to insert into the skins of animals where they can be traced. That we establish an incentive program for security systems, such as invisible and tamper-proof electronic laser fencing. Investigate methods to track the security and integrity of livestock. For example, subcutaneous electronic chips that can be placed under the skin of animals. Investigate the feasibility of farm area patrols in high-density areas, such as the Spring Hall Land Lease Project and the Gibbons Bogs area, where there is considerable concentration of farmers. That we will implement frequent programs to sensitize the police and the judiciary about pre-deal larceny and to devise responses and solutions to sensitize farmers about the protection and security. That we will evaluate the use of electronic surveillance systems and drone technology to assist in the protection of farms and farmers' produce. Madam President, the farmer is an important contributor to food security of this nation. His or her efforts contribute to the generation of employment, to saving foreign exchange, to producing fresh fruits and vegetables that help to reduce the incidence of chronic non-communicable diseases and help to reduce the cost of health care. I hope, therefore, that the Barbadian society will see pre-deal larceny as a serious criminal offense and will support these initiatives to protect the farmer and the agricultural sector in Barbados. Madam President, the problem will only be resolved when this society gives priority, appropriate priority, and appropriate recognition to farmers and appreciate the important role that they play in economic development, the role they play to help diversify this economy, the role they play in saving foreign exchange, the role they play in contributing to making Barbados a better place. In so doing, I hope that this legislation will find support in the society at large. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Brathwaite. Senator Dr. Herwood. Senator Herwood, please.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. I don't necessarily see this as a contentious bill to discuss, so I don't intend to belabor my particular points, but I just want to join with members before me in terms of the presentation on this bill. And it begins with a Chinese proverb, which goes, people cultivate trees when there is no disaster, and people live on trees when there is a disaster. And today, this particular debate speaks to a disaster of incalculable proportions, and it's called pre-deal larceny. In terms of any agricultural structure, there are three particular pillars, and Dr. Brathwaite would have, Senator Brathwaite, sorry, would have touched on it, Madam Deputy President, in different ways. There's accessibility, there is availability, and there's a utilization of agricultural produce. In terms of the availability, we are speaking roughly about the production capacity to have agricultural produce on the market. In terms of accessibility, we're speaking more so to the prices that are placed on the agricultural produce and also the location that they're distributed. And in terms of utilization, we're getting a bit granular and speaking about the nutritional contents and value of the agricultural produce without placing one in relative importance, in a place of relative importance relative to each other, sorry. I would say that in order for us to utilize agricultural produce, it must be accessible. And in order for us to access agricultural produce, it must be first available. And this is where I bring my particular discussion in terms of the bill and what the bill offers to Barbadian farmers and the farming society as a whole. It really focuses not only on the government, even though it is a bill being vesseled through this particular arm of the Parliament, It speaks to a collaboration between the government, between the farming community, and also between the private sector without making mention of the private sector entities or the names. In terms of the impacts of predial larceny, has been highlighted time and time again. One, there's the obstruction of the very business model within the agricultural sector in terms of the cost that goes into producing different produce, and then it is heavily outweighed by the lack of revenue, relative to the cost when predial larceny occurs. There's also the non-financial aspect of predial larceny, which is the diminishing morality, or the reduction in morale, of the primary participants in the agricultural sector. After you spend maybe 6-7 months growing any particular crop, and then in one fell swoop, a gentleman or lady decides that he or she will come into your field and reap everything, or most of what you've planted. It makes the sector appear, by extension, very unattractive to those who had prospects of entering and those who are already within the sector as well. And those are the impacts of predial larceny. And by extension, it allows us not to be in a better position to reduce the $709 million food import bill, as at 2021. I suspect it might be a slightly different thing at the end of 2022. But it impacts our ability to service our needs internally. Now, I'm going to touch on the 3 particular areas I mentioned: the support from the government in terms of predial larceny, the support from the farmers in terms of predial larceny, and the support of the private enterprises as well. In terms of the government, the bill clearly establishes that the police force, relative to the previous act, is going to play a more direct role in terms of security and the security apparatus in the agricultural field. The previous bill spoke to the agricultural wardens, and that was an indirect system, in my opinion, through which designated officers would work within the infrastructure of the police force, and they would accompany the police in terms of their monitoring and detection of any trespasses relative to predial larceny. This one clearly states that the police will have a more direct role via the utilization of technology, as the leader of the Senate has acknowledged, in terms of drones. And I know there are some concerns in terms of drones and the level, the capacity of the police, given the already stretched obligations to facilitate activities using drones. But I wish to also state that I do not necessarily see this as an overburdened process for the police force if we take specific considerations into the application of the drone technology. With drones, there's something called waypoint technology, which allows at the click of a button for the drone to actually go in any specific parameter, look any specific direction once it is predetermined, and the police do not even have to hold a remote control. They just do this particular survey of any area once you have the 4 points. If you're doing a square lot, you can do multiple lots. And with respect to the aerospace considerations, we have to also look at the standards of the drones that we have and ensure that there is what is called aerospace deconfliction. Just a long word to mean that you ensure that a drone not hit into another drone, a drone not hit into a tree, a drone not hit into anything that might be within the designated space in the area that you're surveying as well. And this adds to the reduction of the liability associated with using the drones as well. So I don't think there's going to be any significant issue in terms of the overuse of the police force once we can use those technologies and bring those standards into the sector. From the farmers' part, I was happy to hear Senator Bradford, mention an area that's relatively close to me, Gibbons. And only last week, I believe last week, Wednesday or Tuesday, I was at Allen Villa with a group of farmers discussing this and many other areas as well. In particular, they wanted to discuss access to water at more reasonable rates. They wanted to discuss more support for the sector. And one thing that came out of that discussion, and I spoke to them and let them know that I would be representing here today what I told them, is that the agricultural sector in Barbados is not as together as many persons would perceive it to be, many persons would present it to be. And at the core of this security framework we're building here has to be a greater level of collaboration, not only between the agricultural sector and the police, but amongst the agricultural community. I was pleased to hear, coming out of that meeting, considerations to establish a Barbados National Farming Association, which I will support any day of this year or any other year. And I say that not to scoff at already established institutions like the Barbados Agricultural Society, but there is a perception over the years, for lack of better understanding by some, that the Barbados Agricultural Society in the past might have been seen as an institution that went to the newspaper whenever someone imported coconut water from Guyana, that only went to the media when someone imported chicken wings, but never really focused on building the capacity of the farmers in Barbados. And many farmers on the side stood to the side and watched it. They watched it in dismay. Why am I subscribing to an entity that does not take my particular input concerns to heart, but rather only wants to posture, only wants to represent, and only wants to grab the eyes of the media when we're importing from other countries, and unfortunately other countries within this region that form a significant part of our regional food security push 25, reducing the imports by 25% by 2025. Such an unfortunate circumstance. At that meeting, I also told those farmers, all within the area of food security, that I do not believe, I never did and never will, in terms of utilizing grants in any business model for farming. Farming is a business. And when we oversubscribe to grants for purposes of purchasing inputs, for purposes of supplementing what they would consider to be their income, then you're running a very shallow model and not clearly representing the true cost of that operation. And those were the points that I made at that meeting. So I say that to say that the farming community also has a role to play with respect to the security of their own crops. I think the farming community should also come together, because I think that when anyone wants data, if we had a properly structured agricultural sector in terms of the level of collaboration that is needed, anytime that I wanted data like I wanted yesterday, and I called the Royal Barbados Police Service to be transferred a few times to the research department, and then the information that I was given was not substantial enough for me to even bring to this debate today, I believe that the farmers themselves should collectively come together and know very well what data they have to present in terms of predial larceny. And not only data for predial larceny, but data for the sake of having power on the market to make decisions. They recognize that right now in this country, and I recognize it as well, there are perhaps two major players in terms of the importation of agrochemicals in this country. Two major players. They're not the only two that do it, but two major players. And one of the suggestions made at the meeting in Allenville last week was that farmers come together and start importing their own chemicals. And I stood up, played devil's advocate, told them I welcome the approach because it should make your inputs cheaper, but you guys need to come together. You guys need to come together and recognize that there is power in numbers. It is not just a matter of importation. You need to get the standards in terms of the storage of those chemicals. You need to pass the board in terms of knowing exactly where they're going to be stored relative to each other, because there are some cross-contamination issues as well. So I told him it's not just a matter of building a shed and putting chemicals in there because you have numbers, but you need to have expertise within this association as well. Thirdly, I want to bring to bear to this august chamber one of the most important entities, which is the private sector. And some may say, based on earlier proceedings, that we would have had a difficult discussion on the private sector in terms of the banks, but they deserve everything that is coming to them now. I do not believe that the commercial banks in Barbados, based on the current posture, are in a place to properly appreciate the role that agriculture plays in this country. I believe what was told to me at the meeting in Allenville is that back in the 80s and the 70s, we had consultants at Barclays Bank, that if you were a farmer, you could go into Barclays Bank and ask for a loan, and that loan would be vetted by the consultant, an agricultural consultant, who had the understanding and appreciation for the sector, and also knew the potential and the risks associated to that venture. Today, I go on record as saying that, to my knowledge, I do not know of any staff that there is of any commercial bank in Barbados that is specifically catering to the agricultural sector. So if you want to go and take a loan for a car, you want to take a loan for a salon, you want to take a loan and probably take a trip across the Caribbean, chances are you will face the same loans agent if you were a farmer and going to take a loan for agriculture. And to me, that is a dreadful, dreadful situation to face. When I compare it to entities such as the HSBC, and I'm happy to inform that this time next week, I may be meeting the head of agriculture of HSBC UK to discuss how they approach the financial element to their farming community. But in HSBC, for example, you have agricultural managers within the bank. You have agricultural field services officers within the bank, not the farming community, agricultural customer relations officers. That is what we need to move forward in terms of the agricultural sector in Barbados, and it is not divorced from the substantial discussion on pre-deal larceny, because a lot of the apparatus needed for pre-deal larceny has to be financed. And I will not stand here ably by and say that I believe the government should finance all of them. I believe collectively, if we had an organization that represented the agricultural sector properly, that they could come together, they could mobilize resources and get some of these same drones with the same technologies to basically monitor their crops. I also believe that the farming associations should not be treated the same way as any other person that enters the commercial bank, as I said earlier. And in some cases, you will find that those in Barbados that get easy facilitation, receive easy facilitation in terms of agriculture, are those persons who are backed by large other ventures that they are either involved in or large quantities of assets, large volumes of assets, sorry. So the average farmer that's in the St. Gibbons area mentioned, they're having headaches with the banks in Barbados. And I call on the banks in Barbados to take the agricultural sector more seriously. As you mentioned, apart from the some other sectors that are related to agriculture, when you go into different ventures, you don't face the same risk in terms of climate change. You don't face the risk in terms of severe droughts if you're going into a car rental business. You don't face the risk of rising temperatures. Perhaps if you can use a bit more AC, that might be a unit cost. But the agricultural sector is a sector that must be looked at in its own microscope. It must not be considered and commingled with all of the other business ventures that come through the banking sector. And while I'm on the banking sector, I could not help but add a situation that really makes me think about the level and the direction that the commercial banking sector is going. How it is that in 2022, today I can get a reminder from Facebook telling me that 8 years ago, 10 years ago, 9 years ago, this is what it did on this day. And in some commercial entities in Barbados, you can only get your bank statement dating back 6 months. And if you want it more than 6 months, you have to go and pay some $20, $25 to get your own bank statement. How on earth can you tell me in 2022 that commercial banks cannot allow us the opportunity to peruse our transactions beyond 6 months? But yet entities that are not even commercial banks, such as the same social media, can tell me what I did 8 years ago. And I think I don't want, maybe Facebook should become a commercial bank, I really don't mind. But I really don't want to belabor this point. I want to focus on the point that I believe pre-deal larceny within the construct of this bill clearly represents a need for more direct engagement from the police force into the agricultural sector. But outside of the scope of the bill, I believe it calls for closer collaboration with farmers and the police, with farmers and farmers, and with farmers and the private sector and the government together. So with those few words, Madam Deputy President, I take my leave in terms of sitting now, and I want to support this bill in its entirety. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Harewood. Senator Dr. Maynard, please.
Thank you, Madam Acting President. This bill, the Protection of Agricultural Products Act, 2022, is long overdue. And we've had a lot of talk and no action on many of the matters laid out within this bill. if this country is going to have food security, the people who grow the food have to have the protection of the law, so that when you invest in your sweat and labor and your money, you can have returns, and they're not stolen from you at the last moment. Now, Madam President, but more importantly, I believe if you're going to have food security, the people have to eat what we grow. Because we can grow as much as we want and pile it up and send it to the dump if people don't eat it. So along with all of these actions that government is taking with regard to food security, like this bill and the efforts to improve water supplies for farmers, we need to move towards getting the young people, and probably the youngest of them, to start to eat what we grow. Now, someone mentioned Gibbons, and Gibbons is close to my heart. And this bill speaks to protecting agricultural products. But we cannot have agricultural products without the land being protected. And I'm not sure that enough has been done or is being done to protect the land. And what happened in Gibbons and continues to happen is very quiet, but it's a disaster. And I would like to remind all those who are listening that there needs to be vigilance to make sure it doesn't happen again, and that we continue to monitor the effects of it. Because essentially the ground has been contaminated, and the water supply. Dr. Braffett would probably back me up on that. Now, but the protection of agricultural products goes way beyond petty larceny. And beyond these shores, it relates to matters that deals with patents and genome registrations, which are critical. We've been speaking about our black-belly sheep and exporting black-belly sheep, and I asked, I asked someone recently, who really owns these black-belly sheep? Are they really Barbados black-belly sheep? Have you registered it? And can someone else somewhere suddenly declare that they own the patent to our black-belly sheep, as happened with the steel pan, And are we making enough steps in the right places to protect what we own? Now, excuse me. Over 2 years ago, when we had our lockdown, the price of pork fell dramatically. And in the lockdown, people didn't really care if the pork you ate was Bajan pork or if it came from elsewhere. And there appeared to have been the issuance of a license to bring in pork carcasses. And it's had a devastating effect, in my opinion, on the pig industry. And I judge it in a very simple term. If you drive from St. George up to St. John early in the mornings, you no longer smell pigs. And I wonder if they've migrated. They haven't. People are not keeping pigs anymore. And it is because they've suffered. The small farmer who had 5, 10 pigs had to eat them all because the pork that was imported was so cheap that he couldn't get his pork sold. But what has been eaten is the genetics. A Bajan pig is not an American pig. So by signing a piece of paper and giving out a license, someone or some persons have had a devastating impact on 80+ years of genetics in pigs in this country. And that's a long-term problem. I will continue. Now, we all stop by the highway and buy coconut water. And I don't know how many people have stopped to think, where do all these coconuts come from? And are they legally acquired? And if a policeman stopped and asked about the source of these coconuts, can the people who sell these coconuts produce documents? And will they have to? I happen to have a small spot of land in which I have some coconut trees growing. And I had about 50 trees that were specially selected from a gully. They planted pretty close together. So I left all the coconuts on those trees, not because I wanted water from them, I wanted seed. And I came one day and found all the husk at the bottom of the trees. Someone had dutifully gone in, husked the coconuts because I had time, and shelled them. But that person didn't only take a drinking coconut. He took 300 to 500 plants that would have made a significant impact on planting. So when within this act we speak about value, how do we truly assess value? I have a colleague who has lots of quality black belly sheep. Do I assess, when someone takes 5 of his rams, are they valued based on the weight, how much money you get from them? Or is it the top quality genetics he has? Who assesses that value? Can I say, well, this sheep is worth $200 because it weighed 25 pounds? So there has to be a lot more discussion and debate and development in some of the rules which will govern some of the things laid out within this act. Now, on the interpretation, and I will rile up some people here, I've noticed that there's nothing about mushrooms. And the act seems to speak of plants and animals, but mushrooms are not plants. And I wish to remind persons that the mushroom industry in Barbados, where people actually grow mushrooms in commercial quantities, has started. Senator Boyce says it's mushrooming. Yes. But they too need protection. And if the act does not cover what could potentially be a fast-growing part of the industry, we need to fix it. I know there are some who will say, oh, but we accept mushrooms as plants. But the lawyers among us know that if you're charged with the wrong thing, there's no case. And a mushroom is not a plant. I just want to point that out. Bajans like breadfruits, and the government has spent money in importing different species of breadfruit trees. There are some miniature ones along the highway and growing in other places. And there are persons who export breadfruits. But where do they come from? Whose breadfruits are they selling, are sold to them? Whose breadfruits are they picking? And who will truly assess these things when they need to be done? Who will stop the truck that is loaded with breadfruits and ask for the documents to show that these commercial quantities of breadfruits, which are going to be exported, have been obtained from a legal source? I mention breadfruits because there are large numbers of breadfruit trees in certain parts of the island, and you constantly see trucks going around with bags on them filled with breadfruits. And those, I believe, are often people's property. And I know of a case where the breadfruits were being taken, not being sold. But that person has to pay their land taxes, like everyone else, and all the other costs of maintaining their property. And I think that given the shortages within our police force, it seems a tall order to ask the police to do all of these tasks. And maybe Dr. Braffett's suggestion that we need a separate unit is an excellent one. Now, but technology, we must not be afraid to use technology. And yes, drones are useful in agriculture for mapping and disease detection and defining intrusions. But I do not see any rebates anywhere within the agricultural tariff for cameras, for game cameras and trail cameras. I myself have had to invest in some cameras for my 53s, and you'll be surprised at what I've recorded and who has been doing what. I've just given notice. So I would like the Ministry of Agriculture to include in their list of things that you can get rebates on technology that will help with enforcement, like labeling, cameras, and when the drones are appropriately approved, even drones for agriculture. And we shouldn't wait till you have to go and purchase it and pay all the duties on an item and then have to canvass to get the legislation changed or the list of items on the rebate list changed. We should think ahead and have these things done in advance. When the volcano erupted, it brought all that beautiful ash to Barbados. And while it has been good for the plants in the long term, it caused significant damage to plants. And Senator Brathwaite's suggestion about insurance for farmers and their crops is an excellent one. Because if you're fish farming, all you need is the wrong bacteria in your water to lose all your fish. But can you really get insurance right now for your fish farm that covers your fish stock? I don't know. And I think these are things that we need to look at. When a hurricane comes and all your banana plants are blown down, who insures them? Who covers your losses? So if you're going to make agriculture viable, we have to put in place all the things that will be applicable to the industry. If an industrial company producing metal sheets for a roof gets damaged in a hurricane, the stock is insured. And therefore, there needs to be some consideration for providing some type of similar insurance to farmers, provided they are willing to pay for it. Now, Madam Acting President, we will not fix the problem of predial larceny with legislation. The problem of predial larceny is an old, long-standing, organized industry. It is well organized and breaking it is not going to be easy. In fact, it is so organized that sometimes the people who are supposed to prevent it are part of it, because it provides a livelihood. It cannot end with legislation. And there has to be enforcement, there has to be registers, and we really need a separate unit where there'll be records, and one can look from the data that's fed into it and see where in the country problems are happening. There's probably nothing worse for a farmer to come out in the morning and find the skin of his bull on the pasture. And someone has, with all the skills, has come slaughtered his bull and has already sold all the meat. And that bull was supposed to finance his child's education in part. Like, that's how we save. All people put money into animals as part of their savings plan. Now, when there's pretty larceny, and I'll go back to coconuts, and someone takes something as simple as a coconut or a large number of coconuts, they may think they're taking coconuts and they're only concerned about the water. But there are other industries in Barbados that use products for a specific purpose. And I'll give an example. We have various alcoholic beverages that are sold with flavors. And you might find that a particular brand that might have had a coconut brand might be getting all their coconuts on contract from a particular piece of land in Barbados because it produces a particular flavor. So when someone goes in with a truck and raids it, they might affect an important export product that is not coconut water. They may be affecting an important export like one of our rums. And therefore, we have to think about the long-standing and the consequences outside of our shores and how it affects our foreign exchange earnings. Madam President, I am thankful to you.
And I thank you too, Senator Dr. Maynard. Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Thank you, Madam Acting President. I want to associate myself with all of the positive and affirmative comments that have been made in the chamber thus far in respect of this matter. In particular, I want to associate myself with and support the words of Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite, and certainly to thank him for his continued advocacy when it comes to matters of agriculture and farming. I, like him, would agree that unfortunately farmers in this country do not get the level of recognition that they deserve. And I believe that this has to do with the unfortunate love-hate relationship that we in this country have with agriculture. And it is because of, let me say perhaps, the tainted history and the association that we have had with agriculture and our colonial past. So that very often when we speak to agriculture and farming, we evoke memories of that colonial history when the farmer was working in the sun until he back break, until he fingers hurting, and all of those things that our folk songs speak to. And we see images of people in stained clothes and boots. And given our supposed development, we do not see that those that are involved in agriculture are very much at the backbone of our sustainable development. It is unfortunate, Madam Acting President, that we have this negative association and this undervaluing of the contribution of the men and women who often provide at great risk, at great challenge to themselves, a large amount of investment, the very food that we eat. And this is perhaps because as well, we don't often interface with them. Because if you don't go in the market to see sometimes the men and women who are farmers themselves who are trying to sell their produce, and we only go to the supermarkets, then we can become divorced from the fact that we are speaking not about esoteric farmers, but men, real men and women who, as we've commented on this floor before, are farming to pay their bills, pay their mortgages, and send school their children. And when we speak of this term, larceny, Madam Acting President, I think that we can become a little bit sophisticated, because really and truly what is happening, I'm going to get very Bajan here, is thieving. People are thieving, they're taking up and carrying away what it belongs to them. They are taking up and carrying away what these farmers have invested millions of dollars in doing. I can suggest that predial larceny is one of the most discouraging elements of agriculture, and in fact estimates that losses across the region to predial larceny alone in the context of everything else that faces agriculture is in the amount of $312 billion. $312 billion is what farmers across this region are losing in the context of predial larceny. And this is after they have invested millions of dollars. One of the most fundamental impacts of predial larceny that we often don't talk about and tie enough is its impact on food security, Acting Madam President. A study done in 2018 by academics out of the university in St. Augustine tied predial larceny directly to food insecurity in this region. And that is interesting because a recent study has shown that for the English-speaking Caribbean, there has been an increase of some 72% in food insecurity in the post-COVID, in the period now after COVID. So can you imagine, in this region, we have that tremendous increase in food insecurity at the same time that we have what I call this scourge in this country, across the region, of predial larceny. Acting Madam President, I think that we've talked about before that the fact that this act discourages people, farmers themselves, from wanting to plant, to produce, to grow. I don't know if you recall that just in March of 22, certainly I saw on the news a farmer involved in sugarcane lamenting the fact that in broad daylight, it has become so sophisticated now. It's not under the cover of darkness, but in broad daylight, he caught 2 persons in his field in broad daylight, taking away his crops. In broad daylight. But the bigger issue for us is, what does it mean when our farmers feel that they cannot have the security in terms of their production? What does it mean when a farmer has to say, as was done here in Barbados, where a farmer said, I prefer to destroy my crops than have somebody come and take it up and carry it away? Thieving. What does that mean? One of the biggest consequences, and again, borne out in literature, that is also married to this issue of predial larceny, is also as well our high food import bill. Because in many instances, where farmers now are saying we will retreat because we do not have any security, that we, and this is a regional problem, are seeing now our food import bills increasing over time. But that also as well comes from, I think what was said on the floor, is because of what I indicated previously, that we don't value the farmers. We don't value the produce that comes from the land. And that is also as well part of an international system. I recall when I was heavily involved in trade negotiations in the WTO in the very, very early years, hearing a US negotiator say out of her mouth, she said, it is an acronym of bygone days for people to think that they need to feed themselves. And this was in the context of a World Trade Organization where developed states were, of course, trying to open the economies of developing countries for imports. And that same United States was one of the main beneficiaries of those imports, and also one of the countries that was delivering the highest level of subsidies to their farmers. So as they were praying open the economies of developing states and telling us, don't bother to feed yourselves, take my import, they were subsidizing their farmers in order for them to be able to grow and support their country, because they understood that importance. So we have these twin things that are happening. One, an international economy that wants us to continue to import our food. On the second hand, we have an agricultural sector that is impacted by predatory larceny and other concerns, and as well a society that doesn't fully recognize how fundamental it is for us to be able to feed ourselves. And that is critical, Acting Madam President, that we understand that. I want, Acting Madam President, to also say as well that I've heard the calls and the indications that the Predatory Larceny Act will not solve the problem, that we need a suite of other measures. I want to suggest, however, that amongst those suite of measures has to be that Barbadians take some responsibility for being their brother's keepers, so that when I go to the coconut vendor, that I will ask, I will not wait for the police to come and ask them, but when I go to buy my bottles of coconut, because I am a responsible citizen, because I understand that if those coconuts maybe have been received through theft, that I have a responsibility to my fellow farmer, to my cousin, to my neighbor, whoever it is, to not support that activity. In the context, Acting Madam President, of the fact that we have a constrained economy, all of us are going to be price conscious. And in the context of being price conscious, we may feel that we then have to support or buy the items that are offered at the lowest bidder. But I want, Acting Madam President, to encourage us that we need to see the wider and broader picture of that impact on the farmer, his investment, the potential health risk, even to ourselves in the context of food safety, and then to the wider economy of being sure that we take responsibility for being our brothers, our sisters' keeper, so that this act cannot stand on its own without us taking that responsibility. So that when people offer us produce, and this is one of the fundamental changes in respect of the 27 Act as opposed to what is being offered in this 2022 legislation. Before, there was a complicated process of having to produce, bill of ladings, and not bill of ladings, but this book that you had to produce, it had to be registered and all of those things. And now we are saying the evidence that you have to produce can be something as simple as a receipt, a bill of lading, etc. So we are seeking to simplify the process in terms of being able to provide evidence that, in fact, the produce that you have and the produce that you receive has been sourced from legitimate sources. and it places accountability not just on the police, not just on technology. It places responsibility at us, at the average citizen, to be able to address this issue. My final point, Acting Madam President, in respect of this, again, has to do with the tremendous risk and challenge that farmers are facing in the context of their production, and the extent to which this theft, the larceny, the thieving, the carrying away, adds an additional layer of challenge for farmers across this country, and even in the region, because I want to go wider than Barbados, in the region, particularly in the world that we are facing now. Unfortunately, the conversation now has become more acceptable because we can talk about supply-side constraints because of Ukraine, etc. But the issues of agriculture and predatory larceny predated much of that. So that we have for farmers facing, as Senator Dr. Charleston Bradford indicated, the fundamental issue of climate, of environment, of market, of investment, all critical issues that farmers have to contend with. I am happy to be part of a government, however, that is seeking in the context of its policies to be able to address some of these critical challenges. One of the programs that the government has undertaken is a program called FEED. And since the establishment of the Farmers Enfranchisement and Empowerment Program in 2019, the government, through the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security, has provided land to over 250 first-time farmers all across Barbados. The provision of land, however, is but one pillar of FEED, because there is a clear understanding that just giving land is not necessarily empowerment. So the FEED program provides training in order to ensure that these farmers know how to budget, know how to do their market analysis, marketing, and all of the other core skills that are critical to ensure that they can be successful. And that is a program that the government will be expanding in order to scale up production right across this country. And very often, those participants of that FEED program are young men and women who this government is investing in the context of agriculture. I also want to speak to that in the context of addressing some of the critical challenges facing the agricultural sector, that this government is seeking to expand through its work in Suriname, its work with Brazil, its work with Guyana, a massive build-out of agricultural production in ways and in areas that have not traditionally been tapped. Beekeeping for young men as an area, as an area that we can have young men being able to go in, and I say young men, it should not be gendered, young men and young women, being able to go in order to be able to make an income in an area of agriculture that was underlooked before, that this government is seeking to pick up. This government has, as well, is investing, and we talked about it before, it was on the floor, somebody said, people have to eat what is produced, in encouraging people to have kitchen gardens right within communities. Right within communities. The government will be incentivizing for the establishment of kitchen gardens in homes across communities and providing support for that build-out. so that we are not only addressing the issue of agriculture and the challenges just from a punitive standpoint in the context of legislation and fines, but the government is having a complete program that addresses the issues. I also want to say, Madam Acting President, that certainly the government is also placing emphasis on education and consultation. Certainly the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security, in the development of the updating of this bill that is before us, had consultations across the farming sector to ensure that it reflected what was needed by the farming sector itself, and that therefore at the end of it, we can have an act that would be owned, and ownership is also critical within this process. So again, Acting Madam President, it is not just one pillar, it is not just one plank. The issue of creator larceny in itself is critical and is important, but the government is also as well building out what I always like to say is a full system of support for the agricultural sector going forward. As I close, Acting Madam President, I want to close by reiterating and by asking Barbadians once again to look at this act as a way of securing the business, the livelihoods of our farmers, those farmers that feed us the sweet potatoes that we eat, the eddos, the carrots. There are real people behind that production. And this bill and the enforcement of it, we are asking as a government that the people of Barbados join us, that they help us be the eyes and ears in protecting the sector and the livelihoods of the men and women who depend on it. I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Monroe Knight. Senator Cummins, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Acting President. I wish to express my appreciation to all of the honourable senators who spoke on this bill, from Senator Dr. Charleston Brathwaite, Senator Lorenzo Harewood, Senator Dr. Chris Maynard, and then finally, Senator Dr. Chantal Monroe Knight. The commitment being given from the members in this place, I hope, to protection and the development of agriculture and support for the persons who are functioning in the agricultural sector can hopefully be mirrored by those across the Barbadian society who I believe understand the important points which were made by all of the honourable senators who have spoken. They also understand the points which have been made in the other place when this bill was first debated, and they very much also understand the points that are being made by the representative bodies and by the Minister of Agriculture himself. It is a terrible thing not just to think about the fruits of your labour. You have put all of this hard work into building a business and building a livelihood, and to find your fields gutted on the eve of harvesting, to find your livestock slaughtered, and then to have someone who has not sowed reaping your benefits and then being able to derive a commercial benefit therefrom. There is something fundamentally wrong with that. And if we describe it in the terms of this legislation as predial larceny, and Barbadians talk about it, or we describe it as deprivation of lives and livelihoods, or we call it thieving, taking it when it belonged to you, as Senator Monroe Knight did, it all speaks to us ensuring that people respect, understand, and support the agricultural sector across this country, and in so doing, support this item of legislation. And with these few words, Madam Deputy President, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time. All those in favor?
Aye.
And those against? Please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam Acting President, I beg to move that this Senate do now dissolve itself into a committee of the whole for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that this Senate do now resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it. This House will resolve itself into committee.
Senate is in committee.
So, Deputy President, may we take the bill in parts?
Agree. Yeah. Permission granted.
What do you say? Thank you, sir. Clauses 1 to 5.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clauses 1 to 5 do stand part.
The question is that clauses 1 to 5 stand apart. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Against, please say no. Thinks the ayes have it.
Clauses 6 to 10.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clauses 6 through 10 stand part.
The question is that clauses 6 to 10 stand part. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clauses 11 to 15.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clauses 11 through 15 stand part.
The question is that clauses 11 through 15 stand part. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The schedule.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that the schedule be the schedule to the bill.
The question is that the schedule be the schedule to the bill. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Report.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that you do not report to Her Honor, Madam Deputy President, the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to Her Honor, the Acting President, the passing of one bill in committee. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The acting deputy president has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee.
Madam Deputy President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be now read a third time. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam Acting President, I wish I could be consistent in what I'm calling you. Madam Acting President, this I beg to move that this act now do pass and be cited as the Protection of Agricultural Products Act 2022.
The question is that this do now pass and be cited as the Protection of Agricultural Products Act 2022. Those in favor, please say aye. Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam Acting President, that brings us to the end of government business for the day. I want to thank the honourable senators who have joined the debate today and the deliberations, and I beg to move that the Senate do now be adjourned, sine die.
The Senate is adjourned, sine die. The question is that the Senate be now adjourned, sine die. Those in favor, please say aye. Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.